So now I would like to introduce you all to our voice of inspiration. So Shanté lives outside of Boston and attended the Renfrew Center of Boston. Shanté recently changed professions and is an entrepreneur supporting women-owned businesses to thrive. At this point in life, Shanté is seeking balance and healing. She is passionate about ensuring everyone has access to culturally sensitive, trauma-informed care. And recently, Shanté has partnered with Renfrew in sharing the importance of art therapy in the eating disorder recovery process, which Shanté knows from our conversation before this, I love and think is great. And so Shanté, I will turn it over to you to tell us just a little bit kind of about you and your story and your recovery. So thank you, Shanté.
Thank you, Erin. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And I just want to take a moment to thank Renfrew, not just for inviting me to share my story, but also for endless patience and support and encouragement in my recovery process. My eating disorder journey has been a long one, a journey in which I couldn't or wouldn't vocalize that there was anything to even be concerned about. Much of my life as a child, a teenager, and young adult swirls around moments of big T and little t trauma. My trauma response has always been to shrink the physical and emotional space I'm taking up. Everything about who I thought I was before coming to Renfrew was built on achievement and flying under the radar as a coping mechanism. Everyone says your worth is not conditional, but there's always been an abundance of evidence that my worth is conditional. And if I can meet those conditions, I can avoid walking on eggshells and drawing attention. I became hyper productive in school and in my career. I was chasing the next degree and the next big job. In my mind, achievements kept me out of trouble and absolutely defined my worth. Seeking achievements was also a really good distraction from taking care of myself. My relationship with my family has always been rather fraught, and even more so as an adult. I prided myself on independence and not ever needing anyone. I built a very nomadic life. I was constantly packing up, moving, changing jobs, and ending relationships. My self-sufficient lifestyle was praised, and I only would reach out if there was an emergency. In my 17 years away from home, I've called for one surgery and one emergency room visit, but I never requested in-person comfort or support. I knew if I asked for my mom or my sister to come be with me, I wouldn't garner the love and support I needed. And in reality, I would be trying to tap an emotionally toxic well. In the year prior to Renfrew, I decided to work with a therapist to manage my ever-present high-functioning anxiety and depression. I also started to work with a dietitian. My intention in our work together was always to physically disappear. Looking back, I'm rather glad that I chose a health at every size aligned dietitian whose intention was so different from my own. I thought health at every size meant she'd work with people in larger bodies, which yes, she does, but I also had a lot to learn in our work together. I met with both of these fabulous women each week for nearly a year before they even knew each other existed. In my mind, I didn't see a connection between trauma, anxiety, depression, and wanting to shrink. So I didn't see a reason for them to speak with each other. On a deeper level, I also knew that if they connected, there would be larger concerns about my well-being. I felt that by just showing up every week, I was doing the work. The vulnerability to start the healing process was not in my repertoire. In therapy, we would talk about my high-pressure job, lack of sleep, overcommitting myself, but never anything beneath the surface. And with my dietitian, we would talk about body image, navigating the grocery store, and how my time and work schedule physically didn't lend itself to food regularly. Once they connected and became a team, it started to become obvious that I needed a higher level of care. Behaviors that had been habits throughout most of my life were identified as eating disorder behaviors, and they were starting to crop back up in my day-to-day routine. I was obstinate for a long time about a higher level of care or even group therapy, believing that one, I absolutely did not have an eating disorder, and two, that I could manage complex PTSD in my therapist's office. I can now look back and see that healing could not be done on my own. The next time my team suggested I call Renfrew, I agreed without a fight and without any pushback. Ultimately, I spent more than a year in the nearly continuous care of Renfrew at one level or another. I logged into PHP orientation under the impression that in 8 to 10 weeks, I could check treatment off of my endless to-do list as completed. I remember the suggestion that when in PHP, you're fully committed to PHP and are doing nothing else after program ends. And I considered myself to be unique in what I could juggle. So I was in PHP 5 days a week. I was working full-time and a full-time doctorate student. I would do recovery perfectly. I would only go through treatment once. And even starting recovery, as you can see, I was overfunctioning and not actually showing up for myself. And if anyone had told me at that point that I would do PHP and IOP 3 times, I would have laughed. Not only was I doing too much, I wasn't connecting to people. I had strong reservations about being vulnerable with strangers. I was skeptical of group therapy. I wanted nothing more than anonymity in my healing process, given the nature of my job. I couldn't fathom asking someone from my family to come to multifamily group. That would mean I'd have to admit I was failing. Being sick was not what I considered failing. I considered needing help as failing. From that first day, I told myself I would be honest about my struggles with my team, my Renfrew team and my outpatient team combined. I'm sure you're thinking about the secrecy of eating disorders and realizing honesty did not happen at all levels. I thought for sure that everyone else in treatment was succeeding in 100% meal compliance and pushing through urges. It wasn't until I started to connect with others, to really listen to everyone's relational check-ins, that I recognized that everyone was struggling, that I wasn't unique, that I needed to buy into treatment more, that perfection in recovery doesn't exist and progress is a more satisfying target to hit. In my time with Renfrew, I would be in groups with folks who were treatment fatigued or frustrated with the process. And I had moments of frustration, but I also wanted to put myself in spaces that were uncomfortable and challenging. I was eager to attend art therapy groups because creativity gave me an outlet for feelings I wasn't ready to communicate and didn't even know how to communicate. I sketched and painted my feelings until I was ready to use my voice. Trauma Track helped me to develop processes to manage my nervous system and gave me terminology that would help outside of treatment. This group made living with trauma less secretive, less stigmatized, and helped me find different ways to manage triggers. And outside of individual therapy, Relational Group was the space in which I would grow and stretch the most. In this group, I realized I couldn't identify a single supportive relationship in my life, with friends or family. I was devastated by existing in a space of relational poverty, but I was able to take what I learned and apply it to my relationships. I paired what I learned in group with a lot of research done on my own around relational cultural theory as a form of personal development. I was establishing boundaries, communicating my needs, and investing emotional energy in people I truly cared about. I have also expanded my understanding of the work to include the immensely difficult vulnerability of sharing more with my outpatient team. They care about me, they worry about me. Our relationship extends past the 50 minutes a week I spend in their offices. I am more open, more honest, less performative, and more myself. In Relational Group, it finally clicked for me that I couldn't do recovery alone, that supports don't have to be biological family members. And this has been my greatest takeaway. Not doing it alone was a regular topic of conversation and program, but again, I approached this topic like I was unique. I was doing it alone, I didn't need anyone, and would continue to do it alone. Today, my closest supports are my friends I met through Renfrew. They have become my chosen family. By leaning into the discomfort of vulnerability, we were able to create zesty, reciprocal, growth-fostering relationships. Yes, we all have our struggles, but we are also able to celebrate wins, communicate when we need help, or when we don't have the bandwidth to support each other when our cups are empty, and have a genuine love for each other. Post-Renfrew, I'm trying to live a more values-oriented life. I left my doctorate program after realizing that having more credentials behind my name isn't my dream and does not have a value add to my life. I recognized that my job was feeding my eating disorder and preventing my growth and healing. So I left. and I created a job that supports me in this season. I'm still doing food exposures. I still work through an arc when urges pop up or life feels particularly difficult. I still have times when I'm having that internal debate about if I even have an eating disorder or not. Because I'm not doing recovery alone, I didn't want to share only my words with you today. I asked some of my friends what their biggest takeaways were from our time in Renfrew. I'd like to leave you all with these last 4 thoughts from my sweet friends. 1, you will survive what seems unsurvivable. 2, the things that make us vulnerable are also the things that make us strong. 3, feelings are data and all feelings have function. The goal is not to feel better, but to get better at feeling. And 4, life will not ask you to slow down, pivot, and create a happier, more peaceful, authentic way of living. It's up to us to face the darkness. I didn't realize that recovery would be the hardest thing I do in my life. And I didn't realize that I'd need to step back from everything that I felt defined me in order to truly put 2 feet into recovery. I've used my time and energy to focus on healing and living the life I want to, instead of a life that will draw the least amount of attention from others. I am not a nomad. I have set down roots. I have made connections that I believe will last a very long time. I take up space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanté. It's so amazing to hear like all of the growth and progress that you've made and are continuing to make. And I mean, I think it's amazing. I loved when you said feelings are just data, because so often like that's the best way to think about it, is like, this is just information I've got to collect and I've got to think about and see, and not something that I've got to run away from. It's actually like really helpful information. So thank you so much. Oh, got chills. So I know we said we do have some question and answer time, so we will move into that. If you all have any questions you'd like to ask Shanté, please put them in the chat. Just again, make sure it's going to all panelists. But to start, Shanté, you spoke about this a little bit like as you were just speaking, but you know, at this point in time, when you think about support, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think when I look at what support means for me right now, it means that I have a different expectation of what kind of support I'm going to get from where. So, like from my Renfrew friends, absolutely, we are in the weeds and we are talking about when we are struggling and when we're winning. And also, not all of our conversations revolve around eating disorders. Which I think was probably one of my biggest hesitations making friends in program. And I know that if I reach out to my family for something, I have a different expectation for what I'm going to get there. And it's not necessarily that I'm looking for a deep, meaningful conversation or a warm hug through, my cell phone or something like that, but just a little bit of encouragement. And so I have definitely adjusted my expectations, and even thinking about support from my outpatient team. I think that the more I have become vulnerable and have really kind of dug beneath the surface with them, the support has changed. And I think it's a response to like what I'm willing to put on the table.
Yeah. How have you seen that idea of like support shift over time?
Yeah. I know I mentioned that I was like setting boundaries, and like I took what I learned in relational group and I applied it to life, and I absolutely did. I had a friend where I came in with some boundaries last year after being discharged, and my boundaries were actually not well received. And you spoke about this earlier, Erin, as well, that friendships change season, and that's fine. And I actually realized that I had to let go of that one, it was really sad. It was like my best friend broke up with me in reality. I was heartbroken for a very long time, but we're not supposed to stay the same. And I think that's actually the biggest shift that I've seen in support, like the understanding that we as humans do change and we learn and we grow, and being willing to see that in someone else and respond to that has been really moving. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think it is, I'm so impressed because I think it's one of the hardest things to lean into is that like that grief and that loss when those relationships change. Cause it is like you said, it breaks your heart and all of a sudden you're like, ah. And then to get to that acceptance piece is just so amazing. Yeah, I'm just blown away. At this point in time, how do you know when you're in a relationship that feels supportive?
I would say very similarly to what you said, like that warmth that you feel, that internal warmth. But it's not just about what I put in. I know that I am 100% on the people pleaser scale. Like I hang out there, I will, yes, whatever I can do to make you happy. But also being able to accept other people's help, being able to ask for help, knowing that there is more to the relationship besides that like give and take. There should be like an equal give and take, but that there's more and you want to be together. I'm sure you've heard about like the 20-second hug is like a means to like regulate your nervous system, right? But the 20-second hug only works when one person is not giving more of their weight to the other person. It's an equal balance and you're both able to stand on your own 2 feet. And I think that that's when I know that I'm in a relationship that is going to run the distance.
Yeah, yeah. What coming from the chat, what are some of the things that have helped you to kind of grow in your ability to set boundaries?
Yeah, I really had to take stock of where my people pleasing need was kind of overshadowing a lot of red flags. And in the social media world, like everybody's like posting about red flags and red flags and red flags. It's very trendy right now.
Yep.
But also like red flags are noticing when you're not being treated right. And I did step back and I went to therapy with a lot of my relationships, and I would kind of put this like these relationships on the table in front of any of my therapists. My team has changed a lot, and we would talk about the things in relationships that were fulfilling or the things that I felt were difficult, but I was still pushing through with because I wanted it. Like as I mentioned, I was in a really I was in relational poverty. I didn't have people that I felt I could rely on. And it was because I looked at these moments and I realized that like I was being mistreated and like things were being kept from me, or I was being gaslit in situations. And I actually realized that like my job was a huge component of that as well. And I was being mistreated in that place as well. And like you give people an inch and they took a mile, took much more than a mile. And how sustainable is that? And
yeah. I'm guessing that took a lot of vulnerability to kind of recognize that and then kind of put yourself in that space and say, okay, I can't do all of this. Yes. And that's okay that I can't do all of this. When you think about vulnerability, like what does vulnerability mean to you? And do you feel like that's changed throughout like your recovery process? Yeah. You're like, this one's hidden.
Vulnerability has absolutely changed. I think before I started working with Renfrew, I think being vulnerable was very performative. It was what I would deem safe conversation, things that wouldn't make other people uncomfortable, or if it did, I had kind of tested the water as like the level of discomfort, which also you should regularly test the water anyway. Like you don't want to drop all of your stuff on people. But I also wasn't giving anything that was like really me, like the things that have made me a person. I wasn't really coming out in full force with those. Like I went to therapy, and I think in my intake, we had talked about trauma, but we were not talking about trauma the way that I'm currently talking about it. And being able to like dig into specific moments, or to dig into why like a specific meal or eating with specific people, or silverware at people's homes, like why those things make me uncomfortable, and why it's easier to not take care of myself in those moments. Like I wasn't at that level of vulnerability. And even as I was writing what I was going to say here today, I was thinking about if I had been asked to write something a couple of years ago, it wouldn't have been this deep. And I also would have written it and I would have just been done with it. And instead, when I wrote it last night, or I finished, I actually sent it to a handful of my Renfrew friends. And I just wanted to like get their thoughts, and I didn't necessarily need feedback and I didn't need validation. I just wanted them to know that like I knew we weren't doing this alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so great. It's such a major shift for you, and like to go almost a 180 of like, and I think so often in relationships, we can stay surface level. I think about the relational practice groups you're talking about, like, there's this idea of, no, we've got to be authentic. We've got to talk about the hard things in order to really build that connection. I mean, you can have connection and it can be surface level. And how connected does it really feel without that vulnerability? Yeah. You talked a little bit about like learning to be okay taking up space. What helped you get to that space?
Yeah. So taking up space for me is like at the center of my entire recovery process. Taking up physical space and taking up emotional space, taking up airtime. I was thinking, I don't know as if I would have done this prior to like starting with Renfrew. Besides like speaking engagements for my job, I don't think I would have. But pretty regularly, I would say like every week with at least one of my team members, we're talking about taking up space and where there is discomfort about that, where it feels okay. And it's so much more than using my voice, which definitely shifted from when I started with Renfrew to my last round through PHP and IOP. I think when I started, I was quiet. I was fully virtual the whole time. And so I could just like be a square on the screen. And then by my last cycle through, I was also that person like, excuse me, there are 30 of us on the screen, and it would be great if other people besides me talked. Because that's how we grow together when we're having a reciprocal relationship and being vulnerable together. And I couldn't articulate that like when I started, and I was that equally quiet person in the beginning too.
Yeah. How do you feel like and you and I talked a little bit about this before today, but this virtual environment, I think, is to some degree here to stay, and in a lot of ways, in a lot of places, it's going to stay. How do you feel like you've noticed it impacting like relationships and connection for you?
Yeah, I think in my relationships with my friends, with my family, my Renfrew friends, like we have a virtual relationship, even if it's not Zoom. Like if you're thinking like text messages and phone calls and FaceTime, like that is all very virtual. I very intentionally live thousands of miles away from my family. And so my world exists there. And I think when things are limited to the virtual space, if you aren't willing to like open yourself up and be vulnerable in that space, then you are building a very intentional, smaller box, really. So with my family, they don't know that I have been in recovery or that I've done Renfrew or that I even have an eating disorder. Like that is entirely off limits for our relationship. And so I do hold a pretty firm boundary on like what is mine to share, and this isn't mine to share with them. Well, it's mine, but I'm not going to share with them. And with my Renfrew friends and my other friends, there is also the importance of like making sure our relationship exists off of the screen. That has probably been one of the most exciting pieces in this not quite post-pandemic world. We have, this like zesty friendship, and we have this interest and desire to be with each other in person. And I remember after discharging, like meeting people for the first time, and like it feels like you know people because you've spent hours with them on screen, but we would like walk into restaurants and cafes and the first thing people would say is like, oh my God, you have legs. And it was like, yes, you do have legs. But it was like no time had passed, and it wasn't like we had been sitting in Zoom forever. We could have been sitting next to each other in Boston, in Renfrew. And it has been really wonderful. And I do spend a lot of time with my Renfrew friends in person, or texting, or whatever space feels good for us and whatever we have the bandwidth for.
Yeah. Well, and I love, Shanté, you bring up like that, like the willingness piece, I think that's the big thing. The virtual environment can be just as connecting when we're willing and able, and like you said, have the bandwidth to really engage in it.
Mm-hmm.
And, those times when we know, like, I'm not really there right now, like the virtual environment can definitely be like, I'll just sit back here and watch. And like, yeah. So it definitely, I think, in those ways it does, because like you said, you can feel so much more connected because you can text your friends and do that and do that. And then there are those times where you're like, yeah, no, I need to see someone in person. Like somebody come over, get some coffee with me. Like we got to do something in person.
Yeah. And we'll do things that are absolutely exposures for all of us. But I think that there's also a lot of comfort in doing it together. Like last month, there was one really sweltering day in Boston, and one of my friends blew up a kiddie pool in her side yard, and whatever level of comfort between clothing and bathing suits you wanted to be in, like, let's go. It's 98 degrees out. And we all challenged ourselves to the extent we felt comfortable, or going out to restaurants and getting that meal that we told our dietitian was going to be the challenge for this week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To close out, we've got a couple of people who have been asking if you could repeat the 4 pieces.
Yeah.
And I think that'll be a great way to kind of wrap up today, Shanté. I mean, there's been so much thanks in here, and I apologize to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. But thank you all so much for joining. And Shanté, please share those nuggets of wisdom.
Yeah. So mine, which was not on the 4, was that you can't do this alone. And then you will survive what seems unsurvivable. The things that make us vulnerable are also the things that make us strong. Feelings are data, and all feelings have function. And the goal is not to feel better, but to get better at feeling. And that life will not ask you to slow down, pivot, and create a happier, more peaceful, authentic way of living. It's really up to us to face the darkness.
I love that. All right, and Shanté, I know I said that would be our wrap up, but I will ask you one more question. If you could go back, and you kind of mentioned this in your talk, but if you could go back to the beginning and tell yourself something then, what do you think it would be?
Yeah. On my very first day, I met with the medical director at Renfrew Boston, and he asked me if I was ready to change everything that I knew about myself. I was not ready, and I completely spiraled out of control. And I don't often do that. And I kind of exploded on all members of my team, Renfrew and outpatient, because how dare he have the audacity to suggest that who I am needed to be changed. But I think if I could go back, I would probably encourage myself to settle just a little bit and lean into that just a tad bit, because actually everything about me has changed since then.
That's amazing to hear, Shanté, and so inspiring. Thank you again so much for sharing your story with us today, and for the willingness to come on here. And thank you everyone for joining. Like I said, we are going to close now, and you all can go to workshop 1. If you're having any issues, please email alumni@renfrewcenter.com. Thank you again so much, Shanté, and hopefully we'll see you around at more art therapy events. Thank you, everyone.